Welcome to the third episode of Fatal. I'm your host, Beth McCarty. I want to thank all of you for listening. I put a lot of work into this podcast, and it truly touches my heart every time I see that there has been a new download or a new subscriber. Don't forget to join my Facebook group at facebook.com/groups/Fatal Podcast. The case that we're covering today is the case that turned me on to true crime. I was 9 years old and watching a Lifetime TV movie with my mom. It was called Small Sacrifices, starring the late Farrah Fawcett, and I remember having nightmares for a few nights after we watched it. I actually had to sleep on the floor in the living room, closer to my parents' bedroom. But honestly, I've been obsessed pretty much ever since with true crime. This is a long one, I'm not gonna lie, so I've actually broken it down into two parts. But there was just so much information out there, and honestly, Diane Downs kind of fascinates me. Anyway, I hope you enjoy. Now, on to the episode. On May 19th, 1983, a woman rushed her children to the nearest hospital. She drove into the ER driveway, laying on the horn. A couple of nurses came rushing out to see what the problem was. "Someone just shot my kids," was the woman's reply. Over the next several hours, doctors and nurses worked tirelessly to save the children. Christy, 8 years old, Cheryl, 7 years old, and Danny, 3 years old, were the three children of Miss Diane Downs. She was the woman who had rushed them to the ER. Diane was 27 years old.
And in Springfield, Oregon on May 19th at 10:48 p.m., Diane Downs drives into the emergency room drop-off. Her car is soaked in blood, and inside are her three small children, 8-year-old Christy, 7-year-old Cheryl, and 3-year-old Danny, all shot at close range. Cheryl is dead on arrival, Christy and Danny just barely alive. As doctors work frantically to save them, police are called to the hospital. For Detective Doug Welsh, it is his first homicide investigation.
It was hectic. People were in crisis mode, struggling to save these kids.
The police were called at 10:40 p.m. by the hospital receptionist, and they were at the hospital 8 minutes later. The police questioned Diane about what had happened, and she relayed the story that she had already given to the receptionist at the hospital. She was asked if she would accompany them to Old Mohawk Road, where the shooting took place, to show them exactly where the incident had occurred. Diane and her father accompanied the officers to the scene of the crime. There were already several officers searching the area for the weapon that had been used, and they had also brought in a search dog, and more help was on the way from other counties. When Diane and her father arrived back at the hospital, Diane was informed that Cheryl had not made it, that she had been dead on arrival. And Diane seemed almost stoic. She didn't cry. While the doctors continued to work on Danny and Christy, Diane spoke with detectives. She told them that she had no alcohol or drugs that night, and she wasn't on any medication. She was coherent and sober. And it was almost as if she felt compelled to keep talking, like if she stopped, she might have to remember. They tested her for gunshot residue, and Judy Patterson, who is the receptionist, she had mentioned earlier on that Diane did wash her hands when she came in. I'm not sure if that has a huge effect when testing for gunshot residue, but they do test for gunshot residue because the next of kin has to be eliminated as a suspect. And she tested negative, and she didn't have any other trace metal elements on her hand either. Diane gave her full name when asked, which is Elizabeth Diane Fredrickson Downs. In the car, Christy had been seated in the right rear seat, and Danny had been seated in the back seat with Christy, but on the left. Cheryl had been sleeping on the floorboard in the front seat, with a sweater covering her. Diane said that they had went to see a friend of hers who lived northeast of Springfield on Sunderman Road. Diane had said that her friend Heather wanted a horse, and she had found an article where horses could be adopted for free. Heather didn't have a phone, so she was just going to run a copy of the article out to her. They only visited for like 15 or 20 minutes, and then Diane said she headed home. She said while driving, she just impulsively detoured. The kids liked cruising around, sightseeing, so they were going to do some country cruising. But after a few minutes, she said she noticed the kids had fallen asleep, so she started heading back towards Springfield. She turned onto Old Mohawk Road when she saw the man standing in the road after driving just a short distance. He was waving for her to stop, and she feared he may have been in an accident or something, so she pulled over. She was asked to describe the man, and she said he was white, in his late 20s. He had dark hair, a shaggy, wavy haircut, and a stubble of beard. Like, he hadn't shaved in 1 or 2 days. He was wearing Levi's jeans and a Levi's jean jacket as well, and a light-colored t-shirt. Diane said she stopped the car and got out and asked him what the problem was. He jogged over to her and said, "I want your car." She said, "You've got to be kidding." And then he shoved her to the back of the car. And then the man stood outside the driver's door, put his hand inside the car. Diane said she heard loud pops, and then realized that the man was firing a gun at her children. First at Christy, where 2 bullets landed, then at Danny, who was found by 1 bullet, and then at Cheryl, who was still asleep under Diane's postal sweater on the floor, where another 2 bullets were shot. Diane was very cooperative with the police. She said that she would sign consent to search forms for her home at 1352 Q Street in Springfield. That's where her and her 3 children currently lived. She also gave permission for them to search her car. Diane was asked if she owned any guns, and she said she owned a rifle that was kept in its case, and she thought it was in the top of one of their closets. She also owned an old .38 pistol, a Saturday night special, which she said she kept in the trunk of her car to keep away from the kids. When the car was being photographed, it looked like there were 2 .22 caliber casings in the car. Diane had just moved to Oregon 7 or 8 weeks earlier. They had previously lived in Arizona. She worked there at a post office as a letter carrier. Her parents had been urging her to move to Oregon. They wanted to be closer to the grandchildren, and her father was the postmaster, so he guaranteed her work if she moved. So she did finally decide to make that move. Her ex-husband, Steve, who was the father of her kids, was still living in Arizona. So she gave the detectives his number so they could call him to let him know what was going on. During this whole process, Diane was best described as emotionally flat. She never got hysterical. She never cried. She just seemed kind of calm and collected the entire time. When the detectives searched the townhouse that Diane and her children were living in, they found that although they'd been there for a couple of months, they were still pretty much living out of boxes. The only thing that was in the living room was like a television set and a chair. And on top of that television were 4 pictures. 2 of them were of Diane herself and 2 of a dark-bearded man. There were no pictures of the kids anywhere. There was no food in the fridge, and the townhouse was pretty much empty. The one thing that stood out was a gleaming brass unicorn statue. It was 9 inches tall, and it was engraved. The engraving read, "Christy, Cheryl, and Danny, I love you, Mom. May 13th, 1983. That was less than a week before the shooting. They did find the rifle that Diane had told them about, and the rounds that were in the rifle they emptied into an evidence bag. They noticed that some of the rounds were silver and some were like a bronze or coppery color. 6 of them were stamped with the letter C, and the other 2 were stamped with the letter U. Diane had also asked them to look for and bring her diary. They copied the diary because it became evidence, and then they gave Diane the original. The diary seemed to be composed of letters to a specific person. Now, depending on what source you read, his name is either Lou or Nick, and I've even read Rob somewhere. But since I've seen the movie Small Sacrifices, and I read the book, which is called the same thing, by Anne Rule, so I will be referring to him as the same. Lou was a married man who worked at the same post office that Diane had worked at in Arizona, and they had an affair. She even had a red rose tattooed on her shoulder, with his name tattooed below it. Fred Hughey, the assistant DA, learned about the shooting when he came into the office the next morning. He was next in the lineup for a case, so he knew that this one was going to be his to try, if it was found that there would be someone to prosecute. He visited the hospital to meet the children. They were a lot worse off than he had originally suspected they may be. He became very protective over the kids pretty much instantly. And Fred Hughey, from what I've read and watched, seems to be a really organized guy. He's always making lists. So he started making a list of things that he needed to do. Like talk to Lou, interview the father, search the house in the daylight, have the car processed, go to the scene of the accident, check all of their clothing for stifling, ID the weapon that fired the rounds, things like that. He had his work cut out for him, and he felt like he was already behind. He also needed to confer with Doug Welsh and Dick Tracy. Yeah, that's his real name. Those were the detectives that were dealing with the investigation at the time. When the car was processed, they found the bullet casings that had been noticed earlier by the detectives. They found no gunpowder particles visible on or around the doors or windows. There was no damage to the car. The interior of the car was red, so it was kind of hard to differentiate between the bloodstains and the shade of the fabric. The console was filled with pennies and nickels. There was a large, semi-liquid pool of blood on the floor below the passenger seat. That's where Cheryl had been lying. The carpet under the glove compartment was loosened, and a .22 caliber lead bullet was found. Blood smears and large drops were visible on the inside of the door next to the passenger seat, probably left from where the child was lifted out of the car. There was no blood at all on the driver's side. They did find gunpowder particles on each quadrant of the car, except for the driver's seat. The back seat had a blue postal worker's jacket with a few bloodstains on it, a pair of rubber flip-flops beneath it, and a single .22 rimfire cartridge casing, stamped with the letter U. There was a pool of blood and vomit on the seat where Christy had been sitting, and blood on the seat back as well. There were 2 .22 caliber casings, stamped with the letter U, laying in that pool of blood. Blood had also sprayed onto the headliner, over the rear seat, and the rear side windows, the side panel, and the rear window. Early assessment of the blood patterns suggested that the shooter had leaned into the car at the driver's seat, which is just as Diane had described it. When Cheryl's body was observed, it was found that both the bullet wounds were fatal. After the first shot, she wouldn't have lived long enough to react in any way except in a reflexive manner. There was still a .22 caliber bullet in her shoulder that was removed. They also gathered 2 paper folds containing gunpowder debris and a yellow envelope which held a gold chain with a solid heart entwined in an open heart. It was a locket that had been gently untangled from Cheryl's hair. Diane and her living children were under guard at the hospital. Everyone felt that they had been targeted for a reason, and a lot of people feared that the killer may come back to finish the job. Steve Downs arrived at the hospital the day after the shooting, and he was also interviewed. He said that he and Diane had probably talked about 6 or 7 times since she'd moved to Oregon, and they were still friends. He also said that he knew about the relationship with Lou, that Lou was a married man, and that Lou and Diane had an on-again, off-again relationship for the past 6 months. He was asked if Diane had any guns, and he said that Diane had 3 guns. She had the .22 rifle, a .38 revolver, and a .22 Ruger. Diane had failed to mention before that she owned a .22 Ruger. Detective Welch asked about all of the guns. He didn't want to tip Steve off that he was just now learning about the Ruger. But Steve said that he had last seen the Ruger about 6 months previously. He said that Diane had borrowed it before and he wasn't able to find it anywhere, so he assumed that she still had it. He said that Diane didn't know a lot about guns, but that he had taught her to shoot those 3 that she had. They then asked Steve if he thought that Diane would ever put Lou before her children. Steve said that there was no way. Diane loved those kids. Diane was doing pretty well at this point physically. But Danny was in critical condition. He was stable though. He moved his toes up when the nurses tickled the bottoms of his feet, and they all hoped that was a good sign that he wouldn't be paralyzed. He had been shot in the back, and he wasn't showing any signs of much movement in his legs. Christy had literally come back from the dead. She still had a tube in her throat to help her breathe, but her eyes followed the doctors around alertly, and the doctors were sure that she understood what they were saying. All of a sudden, though, Christy had a critical complication. She had a stroke in the left side of her brain. She was no longer able to respond consistently to verbal commands, and no one knew what this meant for her eventual recovery. It was observed that when Diane came in to visit Christy, that Christy kind of had an odd reaction to her mom. Diane grabbed Christy's good hand and she was squeezing it and just repeating to her, "Christy, I love you," over and over again. And Christy's heart rate jumped from 104 to 147. And it took a long time for it to go back down once her mom left and went back to her own room. The police felt that they needed to warn the community that there may be an armed crazy man on the loose, just shooting innocent victims at random. They released the first press statement, and it read, "Elizabeth Downs and her 3 children had been in the Marcola area visiting with a friend, and were in the process of returning to Springfield when she was flagged down by a stranger who demanded her car. The suspect then began shooting into her car, killing 1 child and wounding the other 2. He then shot Elizabeth Downs, wounding her in the arm. Suspect then left the area, and Diane drove her vehicle to Mackenzie Willamette Hospital. The case is being investigated by the Lane County Sheriff's Office with the assistance of the Springfield Police Department." Lieutenant Lewis Hentz, May 20th, 1983. There were many people, authorities, Boy Scout volunteers, and search dogs all searching the area around the shooting site. They also had divers searching the Mohawk River. One thing they were searching for was the suspect, and the other thing was the weapon. There just wasn't much evidence without a gun. The search was fruitless, though. They did not find the gun, and they didn't find the shaggy-haired stranger. They did have to move in an area of Hayden Bridge to go in the water again, but this was a treacherous site, even for experienced divers. And in the end, after 1,149 man-hours, they still turned up with nothing. Doug Welsh finally went home that Friday night, more than 24 hours after the shooting. He kept going over the events of the day in his head, and he told his wife then and there he thought Diane was the one who shot her kids. They would interview Diane again the following day.
While Danny had been shot in the back and Christy twice in the chest, their mother is in good condition with a minor gunshot wound to her left forearm. The 27-year-old single mother, a divorced postal worker, tells police that night and later the press a terrifying story.
She told us that she and the kids had been visiting a friend earlier that evening. After it grew dark, they decided to head home.
We were just out, I guess, sightseeing, I guess you'd say. And the kids got tired. They fell asleep in the car, so I decided to just head on home. But I saw a road I hadn't been on before. We like to take back roads, and just went down that road.
It was on this dark and desolate country road, listening to the song Hungry Like the Wolf on the car's tape player, when she says she saw a bushy-haired stranger on the road.
And there was a guy standing in the road, flagging me down, so I stopped.
She said she turned the ignition off, and she asked, "What's the problem?" He said, "I want your car." She replied, "You've got to be kidding." And it was at that time that he pushed her aside and then reached in and shot the 3 sleeping kids.
Everything was done in a matter of 5 or 10 seconds.
She said she had her keys in her hand, and she faked throwing the keys out into this field.
He swung himself around and fired twice. One caught me in the arm, the other one I went off somewhere.
She pushed him away, jumped in the car, and raced off to the hospital. So that was her version.
Danny cried the whole way. I could hear him softly just moaning, and Christy was dying. God, all the blood, all the pain.
Emotionally, she was flat.
I kept trying to tell
Detached.
her to roll over so she wouldn't choke on the blood, and it didn't dawn on me at the time that the blood was coming from her lungs.
Her behavior was not anything that you would expect for a mother who'd gone through this. Not one tear that entire night.
Sheriff's Department search and rescue teams were on the scene early this morning, probing for any clues.
Terror gripped the town of Springfield in the face of such unthinkable violence.
This afternoon, the Sheriff's Department released this composite drawing of the suspect, who was said to be in his late 20s with shoulder-length hair and a scraggly beard.
Diane repeated the story again to the detectives, like it was a monologue. She barely stopped to take a breath. Once she got to the part of the shooting, she said while they were driving towards the hospital, she could hear Christy choking on her own blood, and she kept telling her to roll over onto her stomach. She was just drowning in it. Cheryl was on the floor. She didn't move or make a sound, and Danny was in the back seat, just crying so soft, calling Mommy so quietly. She said that she had a conversation with God and told him to do what was best. If they had to die, let them die, but don't let them suffer.
At night, when I close my eyes, I can see Christy reaching her hand out to me while I'm driving, and the blood just keep coming out of her mouth. And that, maybe it'll fade too with time, but I don't think so. That haunts me the most.
Danny had just been moved to Sacred Heart Hospital in Eugene to await further surgery. Doctors were hoping to be able to ease the pressure on his spinal cord. As of now, Danny was paralyzed from the chest down, maybe permanently. On May 23rd, Diane was antsy to get out of the hospital. Although the investigative team kind of wanted her there so they could keep an eye on her, several people on the team were starting to doubt Diane's story now, and they thought that if she were in the hospital and guarded, that she would soon be at her weakest point. They thought she'd start talking, especially if she was expecting to be arrested at any time. Diane moved in with her parents when she left the hospital, Wes and Willadine Fredrickson. They took their daughter in and took care of her. She said that she was afraid to be alone in her own house. Fred Hughey was on the same page as Welch at this time. He also believed that Diane may also be the shooter. He just couldn't figure out why. What would she gain from shooting her own kids? There was no insurance on them, so there was no money involved. Hughie decided that they needed to find out more about Diane Downs. Diane says that the child Diane, in her mind anyway, was a pathetic, skinny, wistful little girl, ignored by her mother, tormented by her father. A waif, scuffling through the stifling Arizona dust with the wrong shoes as she walks home from school alone. She said she had no friends, and she longed for a better, closer relationship with her mom. Diane had 4 brothers and sisters, and she was very smart. Actually, as an adult, she scored a full-scale IQ of 125. She claims as a child she had no confidence, and she was very shy. Diane also claims that when she was 12 years old, her father Wes started sexually molesting her. She said there was never actual intercourse, but she remembers talking, touching, fondling. And Wes never denied or admitted to these accusations. He just never commented on them at all. And I'm not saying one way or the other whether or not Diane was actually sexually abused by her father. It's not my place to discredit her or lessen the seriousness of such an accusation. All I know is that no charges were ever brought against her father. Diane met Steve Downs when she was 15. Steve was 7 months older. They were both juniors in high school, and Diane's parents didn't like Steve, which just made him that much more appealing to her. Steve and Diane got married on November 13th, 1973, and without telling Steve, Diane threw out her birth control pills. She already thought that Steve didn't love her, and since no one loved her, she was going to grow her own love. A month later, Diane was pregnant. Christy was an easy baby. She was happy and quiet, and Diane loved her instantly, and she felt that she had finally found unconditional love in her daughter. But not long after Christy was born, Diane surprised everyone and joined the Air Force. Christy was not even 6 months old yet. Steve was left to take care of Christy on his own, while Diane was away for training. But Diane only lasted 3 weeks at basic training. She was discharged because she had developed terrible blisters. Diane conceived another child not long after returning from the Air Force, and this put a lot of stress on Steve and their relationship. They were already struggling financially, and Steve said that Diane was not the most attentive mother. But towards the end of her pregnancy, Steve started to warm to the thought of possibly having a son. Unfortunately for Steve, Miss Cheryl was born January 10th, 1976. And in every way that Christy had been a perfect baby, Cheryl was the exact opposite. She was constantly screaming and crying, and Diane actually said that Cheryl was an ugly baby. After Cheryl's birth, Steve got a vasectomy. They had both agreed that they didn't need any more kids. However, Steve didn't go for his 10-week checkup to make sure that his sperm count was down and that he was for sure sterile. And Diane got pregnant again. The vasectomy didn't work. This time, Diane decided to have an abortion. Steve did have another vasectomy done after the 3rd pregnancy. Diane and Steve didn't have a good relationship any longer, and Diane was constantly leaving him and coming back. But he was always taking her back. 2 years after her abortion, Diane started to feel guilty for killing the baby, and she decided that she wanted to have another child. She asked Steve to have his vasectomy reversed. She begged him for a year, and he never gave in. She finally told him that she would just go find a suitable donor and get pregnant on her own then. Now, she was working as an electrician at this time in a mobile home park, and she started to sleep around with a few of her coworkers. She knew her body and her cycle so well that when she was ready to get pregnant, it only took one time. And when she told Steve she was pregnant, Steve and the baby's father, Russ Phillips, both tried to get Diane to get another abortion. But she refused. She felt like she was growing this baby to try to make amends for the first abortion she had had. This proved to be a pretty complicated pregnancy for Diane. She actually thought that she was having a miscarriage at about 6 weeks. She started bleeding pretty heavily. But the bleeding stopped after a couple weeks and she continued to grow the baby. And Diane Downs was born on December 29th, 1979. Steve actually started to grow quite fond of the baby, even knowing it wasn't his. The relationship between Steve and Diane was strained. They didn't love each other anymore, and Diane began to think of Steve as her captor. She started taking her anger out on the kids. She would sometimes pinch them, pull their hair. She would scream at them until her voice was hoarse. Diane had had these children to show her unconditional love, and she felt like they were not doing what they were supposed to be doing. Diane saw an episode on Donahue where they were talking about surrogate mothers, and she decided she wanted to try it. She was happiest when she was pregnant, and she'd always gotten pregnant pretty easily, so she contacted the surrogate company by letter, and they mailed her out an application and a questionnaire to fill out, and she sent it back promptly. Diane was required to be evaluated by a psychiatrist as part of the application process. It's pretty hard to carry a baby for 9 months and then just hand it over. So, the first psychiatrist doubted that Diane would be a good match as a surrogate, and further testing was ordered. So she saw a second psychiatrist, and that one was not so sure that Diane would actually surrender the baby at the end of the surrogacy. But finally, after seeing a few different psychiatrists, Diane passed. She was accepted into the surrogate program. Diane asked Steve for a divorce around this time. She had found a girl's phone number and address in his pants pocket while doing laundry. Steve didn't argue with her when she said she wanted a divorce. He just gave it to her. Diane wasn't lonely, though. She was never without a lover. Seemed like she bounced from one man to the next. And after her divorce from Steve, he made her buy out his part of the house for like $5,000. So she found a guy at work that she could date who actually lent her the money. In September of 1981, Diane traveled to Kentucky to become inseminated. And it took only one try, and she was pregnant before she even got on the plane to head home. Diane continued to work at the post office throughout this pregnancy, and she took to dating a few married men that she was working with. The pregnancy was going really well, though, and she felt like this was the happiest she had ever been. Diane gave birth to the surrogate baby on May 7th, 1982 in Kentucky. She met with the other mother and the birth father, and she handed the baby over willingly, which was kind of surprising to a lot of people that knew her. She collected $10,000 for her part in being a surrogate mother. And she used that $10,000 to pay off Mac. He was the guy that she dated for the short time that loaned her the $5,000. So she paid him off, and then she actually sold the house back to Steve, and she used the remaining $5,000 for a vacation and a down payment on a mobile home. The investigators were still mulling over different scenarios. They had read Diane's diary, and now Lou Lewiston and his wife Nora were kind of on the suspect list. Maybe not so much that they would kill her kids as far as they would want to hurt her. Diane's diary told the tale of a strong love affair between her and Lou, and made his wife Nora out to be a villainess. They were still waiting on lab reports back on the casings, guns, and blood samples. There was one interesting thing that they found, though. When they were moving the red Nissan that Diane owned out of the shop where it had been processed, moving it into the sunlight, they saw a misting of human blood on the rocker panel below the passenger door. It was recognized by Jim Pex as high-velocity backspatter, which is the pattern that blood makes as it flies back from a wound towards the barrel of a gun and the hand of the shooter. High-velocity backspatter would mean that someone had been shot outside the car.
We saw pictures of this so-called spatter. It's drops. When they took the kids, they took Chris and Cher out of the driver's side of the car, and it's blood droplets.
Welch was confident that Lou was the motive behind the shooting, but they still didn't understand why. why killing her kids would get to this guy. They needed to interview Lou and his wife, so it was decided that Doug Welch would go to represent the sheriff's office and Paul Alton would go to represent the DA's office. They were going to head down to Arizona, and then they would call in their report nightly. Alton would report to Fred Hughey, and Welch would report to Lois Hench or David Burks. And the other would take turns basically listening on the other extension just to make sure the reports were identical. Diane visited Christy and Danny every day, and she instantly disliked Paula Krogdahl. I think I'm pronouncing her name correctly. Paula was the one who was going to be counseling Christy. She was working with Fred Hughey. Paula spent 2 hours a day with Christy, morning and afternoon, and Christy actually grew to trust Paula. Christy was no longer in a critical condition, but she was confused and frightened by her inability to speak. It had been a side effect from the stroke. Now, in Chandler, Arizona, Doug Welch and Paul Alton interviewed Lou Lewiston at the police department. Lou had brought his wife Nora, and he insisted that she stay during the questioning. He said that she already knew everything, he was completely honest with her, so they continued at his request. Lou said that he and Diane had met in November of 1981, and they were just friends who worked together. But in July of 1982, Lou fell on the loading dock and he was injured, so he got assigned to do jobs inside the post office. And that put him and Diane together most of the time. They started flirting, and he said that he told her from the beginning that all he was interested in was a fling. Lou said that Diane was already talking about becoming inseminated again and going to medical school and learning how to fly and all these different things, so he didn't think that she would want a lasting relationship with the guy anyway. So he suggested that she have an affair with someone who couldn't get her pregnant, like himself. Lou had had a vasectomy when he was 21. He liked kids okay, he just didn't want any of his own. Lou said that he and Diane started out with quick hidden kisses in parked cars, and then they started meeting often after work at Diane's trailer. One time they met at a motel. Lou wanted the affair to be secret, but Diane started talking about it at work, and it soon became common knowledge. Lou would not come around when the kids were around, though. He said in his mind it was an affair, and he didn't think bringing the kids into it was right. But after a while, Lou said that he noticed Diane was far more serious than he'd intended. She was now talking about how much she loved him and how she wanted to marry him. Lou said he had always been honest with Diane and told her that he had no intention of leaving his wife, and he was not interested in being a father to her kids. But she assured him that she would find a way so the kids would not bother him. Lou said in September, Diane had accused him of giving her a venereal disease. And he said he had no symptoms or anything, and he'd been with no one else except for his wife and Diane, but he felt like he needed to come clean to Nora just in case. Diane had left for Kentucky for her second insemination, and Lou broke it off with Diane right before she left. But she didn't believe that he meant it, and Diane actually hoped that his forced confession to Nora would end their marriage so she could have him all to herself. But turns out Nora heard his confession and she chose to forgive him. The second insemination didn't take, and Diane was heartbroken. When she flew back to Arizona, she expected Lou to be at the airport to pick her up. But it wasn't Lou, it was Steve. Steve claimed that Diane was acting really weird after he picked her up from the airport. He took her back to his house, and they were arguing, and she started doing things like scraping her face with her fingernails, and then she started kicking him. He said that he had seen Diane stick something in her purse, and then she started talking about suicide. He ended up driving her home to her trailer, and she jumped out of the car and ran inside and locked herself in the bathroom. So Steve went running after her, and he's pounding on the door. She's inside, and she's talking about killing herself, and then all of a sudden he hears a gunshot. So Steve actually breaks down the door, and there's Diane sitting on the edge of the bathtub, unharmed, but now she's pointing the gun at Steve. She said if she couldn't kill herself, she'd kill him. Steve was able to get the gun away from her, though, but he did notice that she had shot a hole through the trailer floor. He actually told Welch and Alton that as far as he knew, there was still a bullet hole in the bathroom floor of that trailer. Alton made a note to tell Hughie about this information. If there was a bullet hole, there may be a bullet or a casing left behind as well. In a second interview with Lou Lewiston, Welch and Alton learned more of the relationship between him and Diane. She had gotten Lou to sleep with her again after she got back from her trip, and suddenly her depression lifted. She also got that huge red rose tattooed on her right shoulder, and under it, Lou's name. He had told her not to get it, but she did it anyway. Lou said that he and Diane were spending a lot of time together. They were together all day at work and then most evenings too. And Nora knew the affair had started back up, but she didn't say anything about it. In October, Diane went back to Kentucky to try again at the insemination. And while she was gone, her trailer burned down. The fire was really suspicious. The trailer was brand new. It was found that it was apparently an electrical short and a back wall. This try at insemination was also not successful. Witnesses verified that neither Lou Lewiston or Steve Downs could have been in Oregon on the night of May 19th. Apparently, Lou and Nora were at a bar chatting up a waitress between 9 and midnight, and Steve had been out on a walk with his new girlfriend, and then they went back to her house and watched TV until his roommate came walking up to the house, knocking on the door after 1 a.m. sometime, telling him about the emergency call from Oregon. Just before Thanksgiving, Lou went off to be by himself to think. When he came back, he told Diane that he was going to leave Nora. The kids were staying with Steve now. It seemed to be like an endless shuffle of the kids. They were like gypsies, always on the move. Lou had asked Nora for a divorce, but she refused. That night, though, he did spend the night in a hotel with Diane, but he ended up going home the next day. He couldn't afford a divorce. He did, however, move out of Nora's bed, and he continued to see Diane. Lou eventually moved into an apartment of his own, but he would still help Nora around the house with chores like mowing the grass. In January of 1983, Steve had sold the house, and Diane asked the kids who they wanted to live with. They said they wanted to live with her. Diane ended up doing this crazy thing. She opened her own surrogate clinic, using the fire insurance money and what was left of the baby surrogate money. Diane was also still under contract with the surrogacy company in Kentucky, and when Nora Lewiston found out about this, she called the head of the Louisville clinic after she had read an article, and after that, Diane was no longer welcome in the Kentucky clinic. Diane's surrogacy company never got off the ground. The first prospective parents split up before they could even sign a contract. Diane almost won Lou over, until one night, she asked him who he loved more, her or Nora, and when he said that he loved his wife, she lost it. She apparently screamed at him, she ranted and raved, she was carrying on like a child, and he said, as silly as it sounds, the last straw was when she broke his hairbrush. He ended up walking out, went straight to a payphone, and called Nora. Nora came to pick him up, and Diane followed them home. Apparently, she beat on their door all night, and she called repeatedly. She ended up showing up at their house the next morning. She was in her postal uniform. They were actually on her mail route. Nora answered the door this time, and Diane was telling her what she needed to do about her marriage and giving her advice on her relationship with Lou, before Nora finally had enough and told her to fuck off and slam the door in her face. Nora and Lou ended up going to Texas for a couple weeks as a vacation, and while they were gone, Diane put in her request for a transfer to Oregon. She actually thought that Lou had moved back to Texas to get away from her. When Lou and Nora returned, he stayed with Nora for a few days, but then he did return to his own apartment. and shortly after that, his physical relationship with Diane started up again. Diane's request for the transfer had already been accepted, and she was going to be leaving in like 2.5 weeks. And Lou started to feel guilty, so as a nice gesture, he asked her to move in with him for the remainder of her time in Arizona. Diane did try to cancel her request for the transfer, but her supervisor refused to do it. But now that she was staying with Lou, she kind of felt like they were meant to be together. She actually got a few drinks in him, and then she talked him into making an appointment at the tattoo parlor, and she got him to get a matching rose tattoo. The day finally came for Diane to leave for Oregon. She had already sent the kids ahead. They were staying with her parents, and she was now done with her job in Arizona. I think she was half expecting Lou to join her. But once Diane left, Lou said it felt like static had lifted from his head. He realized that he wanted to try to salvage his marriage. He stopped taking Diane's calls, he refused her mail, and he said that he did tell her once over the phone that they were over. On April 28th, 1 week after Lou told Diane that it was over, she came back to Arizona. She wanted to give him back his gold chain that she was wearing. But she said she couldn't just take it off and send it to him, because when he had put it on her, he told her to never take it off. Lou claims that he was cold to her, and to the point, he didn't lie to her. He told her that he was not going to Oregon, and he didn't want to be a dad, and he wasn't going to leave his wife. And that was the last time he had seen or heard from her until the night of the shooting, and she called him to tell him what had happened. Welsh and Alton asked if he knew if Diane had any weapons, and Lou said she had a .22 rifle, a .22 pistol that she said was Steve's, but she had, and a .38 pistol. He said that he had seen all three of them the night before she left for Oregon in the back of her car. The last thing that Lou told Alton and Welsh was that he believed she had shot her own children, and he believed that she did it because of him. Now him and Nora were really scared. He said he thought if Diane got away with this and was found not guilty, that she would be back in Arizona and she'd find a way for something to happen to Nora. And if Nora was out of the picture and he still didn't get back with Diane, he feared that he would be next. Now, Fred Hughey thought that they had found their motive. Lou didn't want to be a dad, and Diane wanted Lou. So if she got rid of her kids, there would be nothing standing in her way. Fred Hughey was still engrossed in Diane's diary. He had read it so many times he felt like he knew it by heart. And the diary took a sudden turn from love letters of pure devotion to Lou to an undying love for her children. And this change occurred on May 11th, 1983. Christy, Cheryl, and Danny had become the focal point of every entry, almost as if she had just discovered her own kids. She still addressed the diary as if she were writing letters to Lou, but now she was talking about her kids, how great they were, how much they loved her, and how much she loved them, how she thought she may even love her children more than she loved him now. She wrote to him about finding that brass unicorn and how she was going to buy it for the kids. And she did buy it on May 12th. And she wanted to have it engraved, and she told them it needed to be done by May 13th, which was Friday the 13th. But why? It was no one's birthday, and there was no clue of any other important event that had happened on or around that day. On Friday, May 13th, Diane took the kids to the Pacific Ocean. She wrote in her diary about how it was gray and cloudy all morning, but the sun finally showed up around noon. They had flown a kite, and Cheryl discovered a crab claw, Christy found seashells, and Danny dug holes in the sand. The kids were starting to get hungry, and Diane was not able to build a campfire, so they all climbed in the car and started towards home. They'd stop here and there so she could try to find a good spot to light a fire. It was a long drive, and the kids were tired. But Diane still didn't go home. She headed out to the McKenzie River. They didn't stay long, though, because Cheryl really needed to use the bathroom. So Diane picked up her nephew. She had promised to babysit, and then she took all of the kids to Hendricks Park. Then they returned back down to the river's bank. Seemed like Diane just took the kids from place to place to place until it grew too dark to see, and the kids were completely exhausted and super whiny. Fred Hughey pieced together in his mind that the unicorn statue must have been important for a reason. The date had some sort of meaning. Then it struck him. He thought the unicorn was supposed to be a memorial to her kids. The kids were supposed to die on May 13th. Hughey thought that the diary was a well-thought-out alibi of some sort. Diane was anxious for the cops to find it, and anyone who read it would think that she would do anything for her kids. The last page of the diary only had one thing written on it. The date, May 19th, 1983. The rest of the page was blank. It was discovered around this time that some of the cartridges that Dick Tracy had removed from the .22 rifle in Diane's closet had at one time been worked through the action of the very gun that fired the bullets into Christy, Cheryl, and Danny. The tool marks left by the extractor were identical. So this now meant that the possibility of a random shooting was totally ruled out. It would be nearly impossible for a stranger to have gained access to both Diane's rifle and this missing Ruger pistol. As for locating an actual slug that had been fired from the Ruger, they were having worse luck. The only chance they had left was to find a slug or casing from this elusive gun, the bullet that Diane had fired through her bathroom floor last September. Alton and Welsh, accompanied by local officers, went to Diane's old trailer to try and find that slug. Welsh himself put on coveralls and climbed under the trailer. 5 hours of digging, sifting, and probing with no luck at all. They started again early the next morning. It was 115 degrees outside the trailer, so underneath of it, the heat was at least 5 or 10 degrees hotter. They ended up breaking off a chunk of clay from the ground, and then they poured water over it from a thermos. A glint of metal appeared. They passed a metal detector over it. It was definitely metal. It was the slug that Diane had fired into the floor of her trailer 8 months ago, and it was now in Alton's palm. They jumped up and down, hooting and hollering with excitement, just freaking out. But it turned out, once they had that bullet tested, it was so badly damaged that they couldn't get a 100% match with the bullets that had been pulled out of the children's bodies. It was said that it was in the opinion of the examiner that it could not be excluded from having been fired from the same weapon. They had just lost the best piece of evidence they had. Diane was served with a grand jury subpoena to take a lie detector test. When Wes learned that Diane had been served, he thought it best for Diane to get a lawyer. Jim Jagger was recommended by a minister to their family, and Diane did not appear before the grand jury for many months. Jagger immediately detected a recklessness in his client. She was unable to shut her mouth, even when talking meant danger for her. He tried to tell her that she needed to consult with him before she gave statements to detectives or to the media, and she promised that she would, but she hated to take advice, especially from a man. Jagger did write to the management of the hospital, demanding on behalf of Diane that law enforcement agencies and Children's Services Division not have access to Diane or her room, or the rooms of her children, and that those parties, including hospital personnel, immediately cease and refrain from any interrogation or questioning of the minor children and Diane as to any events leading to their injuries. On June 3rd, the local newspaper published that Diane Downs might be a suspect in the shooting of her children. Most people were completely shocked. and others were pissed off at the authorities for their insensitivity. Diane continued to visit Danny and Christy constantly. She'd snuggle up to Christy and whisper things to her. And Christy was beginning to speak. On June 10th, one of the deputies who was watching Christy watched her as she smiled cautiously at her mom and said, "Paula was here today, but I didn't talk about nothing." Christy now knew that Cheryl was dead and that Danny was hurt, but she didn't talk about it. Sometimes she cried, but she couldn't find the words to explain her feelings. Her mother came every day, but the guards were there too, and they would not let Diane shut the door to speak to Christy alone. Diane was admitted to the hospital again for 4 days to undergo the surgery to repair her arm. She learned the day after her surgery that Christy and Danny had been removed from her custody. Fred Hughey had requested an emergency protective order, placing Christy and Danny both under the care of Oregon State Children's Services Division. Hughey felt that he had no choice. Diane had said that she was going to take her children out of the hospital, and no one was going to stop her. There were still tips coming in from citizens, and the authorities were following up on them. They received a call from a man, Joseph Inman. He worked for the Springfield Water Board, and he lived in Eugene. He explained that he had been on Old Mohawk Road on the night of May 19th. It was him, his wife, and 2 kids. They were visiting his sister, and they had left her home in Marcola at 10 after 10, and they were headed towards Springfield. And he said as he drove along Old Mohawk Road, he had to come to a slow crawl because there was a red car with an Arizona license plate in front of him, and that car was traveling only like 5 to 7 miles per hour. He said that they were going so slow it wasn't even registering on his speedometer. He said that the car was either a Nissan or a Toyota. He wasn't sure. It was a foreign car. And they had followed it for 2 or 3 minutes. He had assumed that the driver was either lost or looking for an address. The car wasn't driving erratically. She wasn't swerving or anything. And it was on the right side of the road. And he didn't notice any passengers in the car, but it was too dark to see the driver as well. But he followed behind the car until they reached a straight patch of road, and then he passed right by. He said there were no other cars on the road, and he saw no one walking on the road either. The Inman family had seen a car matching the description of Diane's car exactly, immediately after the shooting had occurred. What a coincidence. On June 16th, Paula, Bill Furtick, who was Christy's court-appointed attorney, Candy McKay, who was Christy's nurse, and Deputy Jack Guard gathered in Christy's room at 11 a.m. It was time to ask Christy some questions. Paula started out slow. She knew that she couldn't just jump into the hard questions. So she told Christy that she needed her to tell her how she got hurt. Christy said she didn't remember. Paula asked Christy what color her car was, and Christy pointed to Paula's skirt, which was red. Paula asked if they were going to see someone that night, and Christy said yes. Paula asked, was it a man or a woman? Christy didn't answer. Paula then asked more slowly, was it a man? Christy said no. Was it a woman? Christy said yes. Paula asked her who it was, and Christy said hard. Paula then said that she would make up some names, and Christy could tell her if she named any of them right. Sue, Mary, Linda, Heather. Yes, Christy said. Paula asked if she had ever gone to Heather's before, and Christy shook her head no. Paula asked if it was dark outside, and Christy said yes. Paula asked if it was past her bedtime, and Christy answered yes. Paula asked if she was sleeping before she went to Heather's, and Christy said no. Paula asked if the ride to Heather's took very long, and Christy answered, long time. Paula asked Christy to try to remember what happened on the visit to Heather's house. Christy indicated that they had seen a horse. She remembered the horse. She didn't remember ever going inside Heather's house. Paula asked what happened after they left Heather's. Christy's face changed. She was frightened. Paula changed her questioning. She asked about the hurt to Christy's family. Paula asked if all the hurts were the same, and Christy said no, Mom different. When Paula asked how, Christy shook her head in frustration. She couldn't find the words to describe how Diane's injuries were different. Paula asked if she remembered when she lived in Arizona. Christy said yes. Paula asked if she was ever afraid of anything when she lived there. Christy said yes. Paula asked what it was, and Christy said, 2, choked, in the hospital, choked. Christy was remembering a time when she was 2 years old. She had a sore throat, a bad cough, like croup-like, and she had trouble breathing. Paula asked her if other things had frightened her. Christy nodded her head. Paula asked what, and Christy said, I'm not telling. Paula asked, did Mom ever hit you, Christy? And Christy said yes. When Paula asked where, Christy raised her good arm and touched her face. Paula asked why, and Christy said, it was me, my fault. Paula asked if Mom had ever hit Danny, and Christy showed Paula on a doll that Diane had spanked Danny. Paula asked if Mom ever hit Cheryl, and Christy indicated that Cheryl had been slapped in the face. Paula asked if that happened very often, and Christy answered lots. Paula asked if Christy liked living with her mom, but Christy didn't answer. Paula asked Christy if she thought bad things happened to her because she was bad. Christy nodded her head yes. Paula told her that she wasn't bad. She told her that she wasn't bad at all, that she was actually good, and that sometimes bad things just happen, and little kids can't help it. Paula asked if she feared her mother, and Christy said sometimes, and then quickly changed her answer to no. Christy answered yes, her mom did have guns. 2 of them. They didn't look the same. One was long and one was short. Paula asked if she had seen her mom carry the gun, and Christy said yes. When Paula asked where, Christy drew a picture of a car. Paula asked if Mom shot the guns, and Christy said lots. When Paula asked where, Christy drew a picture of a target and indicated Arizona on the map. Paula asked if the gun was kept inside anything, and Christy nodded, but she couldn't find the word. Paula asked her if it was closed by something you find on clothes, and Christy nodded her head yes. Paula then pointed to a button, a snap, and finally a zipper. Christy nodded again and drew a picture of a pouch for a gun with a zipper. Paula asked if Christy had seen the gun in the car in Oregon, and Christy said yes. When Paula asked which gun, Christy said both. Paula asked where, and Christy indicated the trunk of the car. Paula asked who had put them there, and Christy answered Mom. Paula hated asking the questions, but she needed to go on a little further. So, phrasing her questions carefully, she got Christy to confirm that the guns were sometimes in the front seat area, but Mom had put them in the trunk that night. Paula drew a picture of the red Nissan Pulsar. And then Paula asked her, is this where the bad things happened? And Christy said yes. Paula drew a line from the trunk area of the car to the front door area. Paula asked, "Is this what happened?" And Christy said, I think, Mom." Paula asked Christy, "Did anyone tell you not to tell?" And Christy said, "Mom." Paula asked if there was anyone there that night that she didn't know. And Christy said there wasn't. Paula asked if there was a man there that she didn't know. Christy shook her head no. Paula asked if there was a lady there that she didn't know. And Christy shook her head no again. Paula asked her if it was just her family there, and Christy nodded her head yes. Paula asked, "Is there anything missing from the picture?" And Christy shook her head no. Paula asked if anyone had been crying in the car. Christy said no. Paula asked her if her mom was crying, and Christy said no. Yes. Paula asked were Danny and Cheryl crying, and Christy said no. When Paula asked why Cheryl wasn't crying, Christy answered, "Dead." Paula asked, "Do you know who was shooting Christy?" And Christy said, "I don't know. I think." Christy stopped talking, and Paula asked her, "What do you think, Christy?" And Christy said, "I think..." Then her eyes filled with tears, and she stared off blankly into space. Christy tried to draw a picture of the person with the gun. She worked on it really hard. The person had come from the trunk of the car to the front door, but the person in the picture had only a blank face. It could have been either a man or a woman. Paula asked, "What do you think about the person that did this bad thing, Christy?" And Christy responded, "Yuck." Paula asked her, "Are you still afraid?" And Christy said, "Yes, sometimes." Christy was not yet ready to testify in court. An attorney would destroy her on the stand. So Christy and Danny needed to be placed in a foster home where they could be nurtured and supported both emotionally and physically. Several child service workers conferred, and they agreed that the best placement for both children would be with Ray and Evelyn Slavin. In a dozen years, the couple had given long-term foster care to over half a dozen children, and they had also taken in over 200 babies and children for shelter care. Shelter care children were taken to the Slavins when police or social workers had to remove the children from their homes immediately. The Slavins started out by visiting the kids in the hospital so they could all get to know each other. After 5 weeks of treatment, on June 22nd, 1983, Christy was released from the hospital. Her right arm was paralyzed, but she was leaving the hospital alive. Diane's visiting privileges had been rescinded, and Christy never talked about her mom or asked why she didn't come to see her. She grew very close to the Slavin's adopted daughter, Brenda. They were about the same age. But Christy still had a lot of difficulty speaking, but she was becoming more and more verbal as the weeks progressed. Diane was continuing to do news conferences and press releases. She was now fighting to get the children back. She was bad-mouthing Hughie and the detectives, saying that they weren't doing their job, and instead were keeping her children away from her, when she could be loving them back to good health. And the citizens were eating it up. The camera loved Diane. She was able to make the authorities out to be villains, while she was just a helpless victim, just trying to love her children. Soon, Diane got her postal job back. She had called the sheriff's office in Chandler, Arizona, to turn Steve Downs in for arson, saying that he had deliberately burned her trailer. She also said that Steve had reported his sports car stolen, just so he could collect insurance money. And best of all, for Diane, Lou was back in her life. Lou had felt somewhat guilty. He believed that if he had never started a relationship with Diane, then she never would have shot her children. He started calling her, and he was taping their conversations. He was hoping that he could get her to admit to what she had done. Welch and Alton were on a mission to find a bullet, a shell casing, anything, trying to tie Diane to the gun that shot her kids. Their investigation took them to Mexico. Stan Post, who was one of Steve Downs' best buddies, he had lived with Steve and Diane for a short time, had told police that he had shocked the Ruger hundreds of times, and that he would bet that there were bullets or casings that had landed in his old truck, because he would often just stand at the door of the truck shooting, and the casings ejected from the right side of the gun. He had sold that truck, though, which had been sold again. But they tracked it down and found out that the truck was now in Mexico. Welch and Alton traveled to Mexico once they located the last listed owner of the truck, and he did say that he in fact still had it, and he was going to allow them to process it. They met the owner in Chihuahua, Mexico. Welch began to pull up the carpeting in the cab of the truck, and he moved his fingers over the truck floor. There were bullets there. 7 live rounds and a couple of casings. They rushed back to Arizona to have the bullets tested. No luck. Not one of the bullets and not one of the casings matched anything they already had. Lou placed his first call to Diane on July 2nd, 1983. Diane was glad to hear from him, but she was also wary. She didn't trust anyone now, not even Lou. After some small talk, Lou just threw it out there. He told her that he knew she had a .22. And Diane admitted to him that she did have it, but that she had given it back to Steve. He told her, "I seen it in your truck the day before you left for Oregon." But Diane didn't budge on her story. She told him that she had a microwave, a TV, a whole bunch of stuff, but she didn't have that .22 in her trunk that day. The more Lou called, the more Diane opened up to him. She told him that she had taken a lie detector test in private, and it wasn't going to be released. To only him, she said that they had asked her if a white male stranger was holding the gun that shot her kids. And the lie detector test said she was telling the truth. They then asked her if she was holding the gun that shot her kids, and she said no. And it said she was lying. And she told Lou, "You see, it can't be both ways. Either he's holding the gun or I'm holding the gun." So she wasn't very confident in the lie detector test results. Danny was released from the hospital on September 8th, 1983. He was in a wheelchair, paralyzed from the chest down. He would be living with the Slavins as well with Christy. Both children would start seeing a counselor, Carl Peterson. Diane was lonely and depressed. She had started drinking, she said, to help dull the pain of being alone. So she decided to find a man to occupy her time, and maybe to do what she did best, get pregnant. She found Matt Jensen. He was just a year or two younger than Diane, and she had ran into him one day while he was taking his lunch. She was walking through the park, which was on her mail route, and he was there on his lunch break. He was a teacher. He knew who Diane was. I mean, he would have had to have lived under a rock to not know by now. But after meeting her and talking to her, he said he had a hard time believing that she could be a murderer. Matt withheld judgment. He felt sorry for her, and he was nice to her. Danny and Christy were doing better and better living with the Slavins. In September, Steve Downs made a trip to Eugene to visit the children. He invited Diane's brother Paul to join them for dinner one night. Paul reported back to Diane, and Christy looked fine. Said that Danny laughed a lot and he made cute remarks all night. Fred Hughey had known that Steve was in town, but there was no way he could follow him 24 hours a day. He, however, didn't know that Child Services was allowing Steve to take the kids out of the foster home for an entire day unsupervised. Paul had told Steve how lonely Diane was for Christy and Danny, and that things had been really rough on her. And over time, Steve's heart had softened towards Diane, and he had forgiven her for turning him into the police. And he now thought that there was no way that she could have done anything to hurt her kids. So Steve actually called Diane on October 1st and asked if she wanted to see the kids, just to have a look at them, so she could see for herself that they were doing okay. Of course, she jumped at the chance. He told Diane to meet him at a certain spot at the mall, and he would just walk by with the kids, and Diane agreed. But Steve called the next morning and was kind of having doubts. He said that the mall was too public and thought maybe it was best that they meet at Island Park under the bridge in Springfield around 10 a.m. Diane arrived at the park early. She sat and watched Steve's car approach, and then she watched him get out of the car and walk Christy to a bench. He beckoned Diane over to the car where Danny was sleeping in the back seat. And although Diane was just supposed to look at the kids, she broke Steve down and talked him out of the name of this motel he was staying at. She said she needed more time with the kids. So eventually he gave in, and he told her to meet them at the motel at 4. Diane arrived at the hotel on time, and Steve asked her while she was there to sign custody papers to give the children over to him. He then let Diane take Christy for a car ride, just the two of them, alone. They didn't come back when Diane had promised they would be back, and Steve was frantic. He was so worried, pacing the motel room. He had violated a court order and let Diane see the kids, and now she'd taken Christy, and he couldn't even remember where she'd said they were going. It was getting close to dark, and Steve was just about to call the sheriff, even though he knew he would probably get in trouble, maybe arrested, for violating that court order. But he noticed a car turning into the parking lot, and it was Diane. Evelyn Slavin said that she noticed that something was off whenever Steve returned the children that evening. The kids had been so happy and relaxed lately, and suddenly they were sad and melancholy. Christy's counselor, Carl, also noticed that the progress they had made was almost non-existent now. It was like they had to start from scratch ever since that visit with Steve. On October 13th, Diane called Matt Jensen. They had met up that night after the meeting in the park and had dinner together and had sex. And they hadn't really spoken since then. Matt was actually just days from moving. She was pleading with him. She wanted to come over because she was so lonely. He told her no repeatedly. He even hung up on her once, but she called right back. Finally, he gave her a number of impossible tasks that he thought she couldn't complete, like getting an ounce of pot, a 6-pack. I'm not even sure what else, but told her if she completed all of those, she could come on over. And she did. She showed up at his door. She had a 6-pack, but he didn't really comment on whether or not she had come through with any of his other requests. She told him when she got there that she was on birth control now. And Matt later said, looking back, it wasn't a seduction. It was a manipulation. She was using him. Diane didn't want Steve to have custody of the kids, so she had come up with a plan for child services to find out that he had let her see the kids, without her having to actually tell them herself. She wrote Lou a letter. She then called Lou and begged him not to open it. She begged him to send it back to her, actually, and that kind of made it more enticing. He was interested to see what was in it, but he was also kind of scared. He didn't know what she could have sent. It scared him so much that he filed a restraining order on her. But he did open the letter, and he delivered it to the sheriff's office. Hughie was outraged when he found out that Diane had been along and seen Christy. It also explained all of the sudden struggles they were having with Christy's progress. Diane then found out that her plan with Matt Jensen had worked. She was pregnant. This would be Diane's 6th pregnancy, and if everything went well, the 5th birth. When she told Matt, he was enraged. She had planned this and used him, and he told her he never wanted to see her again. Steve and Diane ended up both being charged with contempt of court for breaking that court order with the secret visit. Diane appeared at the hearing ready for anything. She looked different. She was dressed different than she normally would dress. She spoke differently, and she was definitely acting differently in front of the cameras that day. Fred Hughie asked Diane about the visit, and she claimed that Steve had told her to lie about it. She said that Steve had planned the whole thing, and that he was trying to use the children to get close to her. She also testified that Steve had told her that she better stick to his version of the story or he was going to take her out, and she took that as a death threat. Diane said that she had talked to Christy and told her that the authorities told her that Christy knew who hurt her, but Christy told Diane that she only remembered the horses from the night of the shooting. The kid's attorney cross-examined Diane and asked her why she didn't just call child services herself and tell them about seeing Christy. But Diane insisted that Steve had told her that he was going to get custody of the kids, and he would be set up as their placement home, and if she cooperated with him, then she would be able to see the kids whenever she wanted. Diane also testified that the only reason she had told Christy to keep their visit a secret was because she didn't want to hurt the feelings of Christy's foster family. Carl Peterson, the children's counselor, testified as well, and said that ever since that visit with Diane, it had set back Christy's progress. He said that there were elements of the evening of the shooting that she had been suppressing, and they were slowly beginning to come to the surface. Diane faced jail time for breaking the court order, but her lawyer, Jim Jagger, announced for the record that Diane was 2 to 3 months pregnant and that jail would not be advisable at this time. The courtroom was shocked, and the media was caught off guard. They had actually just broken the news about Diane being a surrogate before, so everyone's immediate assumption was that she was carrying another surrogate baby. But Diane told the press that it was not a surrogate, that she was in fact pregnant, and she was happy about it. She wouldn't release the name of the father, though. She said it wouldn't be public knowledge because he was a very private person. The judge ended up giving Diane a 1-year suspended sentence for the contempt charge. Carl Peterson reported to Hughie that, to his relief and surprise, Christy was now experiencing a rebound effect. He said that for every step back that they had taken since the visit with her mother, Christy was now leaping forward 2 or 3 steps. They started working with play therapy, using pillows and chairs. And Peterson had even obtained a copy of that Duran Duran tape, Rio. That had been what was playing in the tape deck of Diane's car. Sometimes sounds, smells, noises, things like that can bring back a memory. So Peterson started giving Christy slips of paper and told her that if she wanted to, she could write the name of the person who shot her and Danny and Cheryl on those slips of paper. She could then seal them in envelopes, and if she didn't want anyone to read them, she was welcome to throw the envelope into the fire. So Christy very carefully would write something on the slips of paper, and then she placed them inside the envelopes. But she held on to the envelopes with the names inside until the end of each session, and every day before she left, she flung the envelope into the fire. Fred Hughey had went to great lengths to have dolls made to represent the Downs children. They were life-size, the same size as the kids at the time of the shooting, and they were anatomically correct. Christy and Danny actually took the dolls home to try to get used to them and know what they would be seeing in court. After a few days, a detective who wanted to meet the children, Ray Broderick, went to the Slavin house. He used the excuse of picking up the dolls just so he could meet the kids. And after the kids got comfortable with him, he asked Christy if she could use the dolls and show him where everyone was sitting in the car that night. They went down to the basement in the rec room, and they had two couches, one right behind the other one, to represent the car. One the front seat, one the back seat. Christy put the dolls exactly where all of the detectives had assumed the kids had been sitting. Broderick then asked if she could show him what happened that night. Christy was trying to show him something, but it wasn't making sense to him, so he asked her if she could play the part of her mom from that night. Christy hesitated for a moment, but then she moved over to the car that was made from those two couches. No one in the room said anything. Christy walked to the front door from the rear of the couch car. She hunched over, and she pointed her finger at the Cheryl doll, the Christy doll, and the Danny doll. There was no roof on this couch car, but she had bent over as if the roof was there. In order for Christy to be ready for trial, she really needed to trust Fred Hughey. It was essential that they become friends, basically. Hughey was actually scared to death of confronting Christy. He had grown to care for this little girl, and he didn't want to do any harm to her. But he needed to ask her questions, and it was going to be pretty tough. So Christy started coming to Hughey's office twice a week. He needed to prepare her for court. He would have to ask her really hard questions. So he explained everything about how a trial would work, so nothing would come as a surprise to her. On February 28th, 1983, everyone gathered in the courthouse at 5:30 a.m., before the court was even open. Almost every investigator who had helped work the case over the last 9 months was there. There was also a female deputy president, Chris Rosage, as they would need one when they arrested Diane. The arrest and search warrants were finally signed and ready. Lewis Hintz would go to the Frederickson home in Springfield. Welch and Broderick and Rosage would go to the post office in Cottage Groves and search her postal locker. And Bill Kennedy and Carl Lundquist would follow just behind so they could search Diane's car after the arrest. At exactly 6:58 a.m., the team was at the post office waiting for Diane's arrival for work when she pulled into the parking lot. They stopped her, and everyone got out of their cars. Doug Welch said, "Today's the day, Diane." And Diane responded with, "Oh, okay." In a small, almost juvenile voice, they said. Chris Rosage moved towards Diane at this time, and she told her that they would be spending a lot of time together. Rosage actually ended up becoming somewhat of a media celebrity herself, because she was the one who was always accompanying Diane everywhere throughout the trial. Rosage patted Diane down for weapons. She was also read her Miranda rights, along with the 5 charges that she was being charged with: murder, attempted murder, a second count of attempted murder, and 2 counts of assault in the first degree. Bail was set at $15,000 on each of the 5 charges, so $75,000. The next day, Diane pleaded not guilty to all charges before the circuit court judge, Edwin Allen. Allen revoked her bail. Her trial date was set for May 8th. On March 22nd, Diane filed an affidavit seeking to suppress evidence that had been taken for her home and vehicle, the red Nissan, on the night of May 19th, 1983. She claimed that she was too upset and distraught, and she didn't really know what she was signing when they brought the forms to her, which gave permission to search the house and the car. But the motion to suppress was denied. Diane's attorney also tried to get the trial delayed, as it interfered with an international trip that he had planned. But they were going to be so close to Diane's due date with the baby that no one wanted to risk having to recess for however long while Diane gave birth. Luckily, the judge denied the request for the delay. There was going to be a trial. Okay, so I think this is a good place to end this episode. There's still a lot to cover, like the entire trial, but this is going to have to be a two-parter, like I said earlier. Again, I'm Beth, and I just want to thank my listeners for all of your support. Don't forget to subscribe and review us wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can find me on Twitter @FatalPodcast or email me at fatalpodcast@gmail.com. And don't forget, we now have a Patreon page. You can unlock special features for as little as $1 a month. All you have to do is go to patreon.com/fatalpodcast. That's patreon.com/fatalpodcast. Also, I'm going to be having a contest where 1 or 2 lucky listeners will win some cool Fatal swag. All you have to do is call or text 812-227-5227 and leave me a message about the scariest thing that has ever happened to you. Again, thank you for listening. I'm Beth, and I'll see you next week for the conclusion of the Diane Downs case.